Wade Colby forked hay in the cold at the Broken Ring for $4 a week, and never once looked up when they laughed. He slept in the tack room on a single wool blanket, gray and thin as a communion wafer, and that blanket was the only soft thing he owned in the world. Royce Thorne kicked it into the horse trough one morning, just to watch it sink. Just for sport. The other hands looked away. Wade fished it out with a pitchfork, wrung it in his two hands, and hung it on a nail to dry. He said nothing. He went back to the hay. 10 days later, before 11 hands at the spring branding fire, Royce stood over him and said it loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "You'll never carry the thorn mark, drifter. It's bred, not begged." And he emptied a month of Wade's wages into the mud, coin by coin, and ground one under his heel. Wade knelt in the dirt and picked them up, one at a time. He did not answer. He never answered. But across the yard, by the cookhouse door, an old woman went white as bone at the sight of Wade's bare forearm. Her hands began to shake. And she said nothing at all. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have looked closer, this story is for you. Before we ride on, do something for me. Hit that subscribe button, because a story like this one only finds the people who need it when you share it. And comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story rides. Go on. Then come back, because we are just getting started. He came into Cottonwood Bend on a borrowed horse in the last week of April 1878, Wyoming Territory. The kind of country that goes on so far it stops meaning anything. Brown grass to the foothills, and the foothills blue behind it. Wade Colby was 19 years old. He had a saddle that wasn't his, and a name he'd been handed at a poorhouse, and about $1.40 in his boot. He rode into town the way a man rides when he has nowhere he has to be, and nowhere he's welcome, which is to say slow and watchful and keeping to the edge of the street. He asked the man at the livery who was hiring. The man looked him over. Young, lean, quiet in a way that made some men nervous, and other men trust him on sight. "Broken Ring," the liveryman said. "Thorne outfit, biggest brand in the county. They'll always take a hand who can work." He spat. Whether they'll keep him's another matter. The Broken Ring ran 12,000 acres. Folks in town said it was worth near $70,000. Cattle and grass and the big timber house all counted together, and they said it the way people say numbers that are too large to picture, just to feel the size of them in their mouths. Augustus Thorne had built it out of nothing across 40 hard years. His brand was known from the railhead to the mountains, and when Wade rode up the long track to the home place that first afternoon, he saw the house before he saw anything else. 2 stories of squared logs and glass windows, real glass, and a wide porch, and a weather vane shaped like a running horse turning slow in the wind. The foreman who hired him was an old man named Josiah Kell, 58, and looked older. He had a face like cracked leather and eyes that didn't hold on any one thing for long. He watched Wade unsaddle, and something crossed his face, quick, like a cloud crossing a field. Then, it was gone. $4 a week and your keep, Kell said. You sleep in the tack room. You eat what the cook gives you. You do what you're told, and you don't talk back. He paused. His voice had gone strange. What did you say your name was, son? Colby, Wade said. Wade Colby. Kell looked at him a moment longer than he needed to. Get to work, then. Wade got to work. The thing about Wade Colby that everybody noticed inside the first week, whether they liked him or not, was what he could do with a horse. The Broken Ring had a bad string that year. Colts that had been broke rough and ruined, and one big roan gelding in particular that had put 2 men in the dirt and cracked a 3rd man's collarbone. Nobody would go near it. The horse stood in the far corral, with its ears pinned and its eye white, and the hands gave it a wide path. Wade went in alone. He didn't have a rope in his hand. He just walked in slow and stood there, in the middle of the corral, and did nothing. For the better part of an hour, he did nothing. He looked at the ground. He let the horse look at him. And then, by and by, the roan's ears came forward, just an inch, and its head dropped, and Wade turned his back on it and walked away. And the horse followed him across the corral like a dog. The hands stopped what they were doing to watch. None of them had ever seen the like. Old Kell watched from the fence and pulled his hat down low over his eyes and turned away. Wade split his bread with the barn cats. There were 3 of them, half wild, living in the loft, and every morning he tore off a corner of his breakfast and set it on the top rail, and by the end of the second week the boldest of the 3 would sit on his shoulder while he mucked the stalls. He didn't do it to be seen doing it. He did it because a thing that was hungry ought to be fed. That was the whole of his philosophy. It was maybe the only thing he'd ever been sure of. You already love him. I know you do. Hold on to that. Because there was another son on that ranch, and he was nothing like Wade. Royce Thorne was 19 too, born the same year, and where Wade was quiet, Royce was loud, and where Wade watched, Royce performed. He was the Baron's son, the acknowledged son, the only living child of Augustus Thorne, and everybody at the Broken Ring knew it, and Royce made sure they never forgot it. He rode a blooded black mare with silver on the bridle. He wore a good coat. He had his father's straight back and his father's hard jaw, and none of his father's patience. Because patience is a thing you learn from wanting, and Royce Thorne had never in his life wanted for anything at all. There was a reason the whole outfit walked soft that spring, and the reason was this. Augustus Thorne's heart was failing. The doctor had come out from Cheyenne on the train and stayed 2 nights and left with a grave face. Augustus was 61 years old, and his heart was giving out, a little more each month, and he knew it. And he had made up his mind about the one thing that mattered to him more than his own life. The land. The brand. The broken ring. 40 years of work, and he would not let it scatter when he was gone. So he had sent for the circuit court. The circuit rode through Cottonwood Bend but 4 times a year, and the land office session was set for the 3rd week of May, 21 days out, when Wade rode in. In 21 days, before the county recorder and Judge Merrick himself, Augustus Thorne would sign the whole entail over to his son. All of it, deed and grass and cattle and brand, to Royce Thorne, sole and only heir. The elder brother died the night your mother did. Augustus had told Royce, once, years back, the only time he ever spoke of it. His voice had gone to gravel, died before he drew breath. There was just you left. And he never spoke of it again. He had buried that grief so deep, 19 years back, that he'd walled the whole night off from himself, the birth and the 2 cries in the dark, and the fever, and his young wife dead by dawn. He remembered only what he could bear to remember. 1 son buried, 1 son living. He had never once questioned it. Why would a man question the worst night of his life? You don't go back and turn over the stones. You just try to keep walking. So Royce strutted. He was the sole surviving heir, and in 3 weeks it would all be his in law, as well as in fact, and he carried that knowledge through the ranch yard like a man carrying a torch through a hayfield. He decided he did not like Wade Colby. It's hard to say exactly why. Maybe it was the way the hands went quiet and respectful around the new man, the way they'd never gone quiet around Royce. Respect you're born to is a thin gruel. A man can starve on it and never know why he's hungry. Maybe it was the horse, the ruined roan that followed Wade around like it loved him, when Royce had never once in his life made a creature love him without a bit and spurs. Or maybe it was something Royce couldn't name, and wouldn't have looked at if he could. Something in Wade's face, when the light came sideways off the mountains at the end of the day. Something that made Royce's own reflection feel like a lie. Whatever it was, Royce set himself against the new hand, and he did it the way small men with large fathers always do it. In public. For an audience. The blanket in the trough was the first of it. There were other things after. Royce gave Wade the doubled chores, the jobs meant for two men, and stood by while Wade did them alone into the dark. He'd ride past where Wade was mending fence and let his mare crowd the new set posts and knock them crooked and laugh and ride on. He made a joke of Wade's name. Colby, he'd say, drawing it out. What kind of a name is Colby? A poorhouse name. They give you that off a sack of flour. Drifter? Colby's best? And the hands who wanted to keep their places would laugh, short and unwilling, and look at their boots. Wade took it. He took all of it the same way, which is to say he set it down somewhere out of sight and went on working. He had learned young that a man with nothing has only one thing that's truly his, and that thing is what he does when he's struck. So he didn't strike back. He forked the hay. He mended the fence over again. He answered to Colby's best without a flicker, and only the barn cats, watching from the rail with their tails wrapped round their feet, ever saw his face go still and far away in the moment after Royce rode off. Now here is where I need you to lean in close. Because two small things happened that spring. Two things nobody at the Broken Ring thought were worth remembering. And they are the whole story. Everything turns on them. Keep them. The first was in the cookhouse. Mrs. Dora ran the kitchen. A wide, warm, red-armed woman who'd cooked for the Thornes going on 20 years and had opinions about everyone, and kept most of them behind her teeth. One noon she was ladling stew, and Wade came through the line with his hat in his hand, quiet the way he always was. And the light from the window fell across him, just so. And Mrs. Dewar stopped. The ladle hung still over the pot. She looked at Wade Colby's face like she'd seen a ghost step out of the past and ask for stew. "Lord," she said, low, mostly to herself. "You've got the old Thorne look, boy. That's the grandfather's jaw to the life. Old Cyrus, before your time and mine both, they say he had exactly that. Mind the line, Dewar, that was Kell, the foreman, come in behind her sudden and sharp." His voice cracked like a dry stick. "You 15 hungry men, and you're telling fortunes. Ladle the stew." "Mrs." Dewar blinked. Colored a little. "I'm sure I don't know what got into me," she said, and she filled Wade's bowl and shooed him along and never said another word about it. A foolish thing. An old woman's fancy. The grandfather's jaw. She forgot it by supper. But Josiah Kell did not forget it. Kell went out behind the smokehouse and stood a long while with his hand pressed flat against the logs, breathing like a man who'd run a long way, because Josiah Kell was the one man on the Broken Ring who knew exactly whose jaw that was. The second thing happened at the pump, 3 days after. It was hot for May and the men were washing up after the branding pens, and Wade rolled his sleeves to sluice the dust off his arms, and Josephine Doer, Josie, the cook's daughter, 18 and quick-eyed, happened to be carrying a basket past the pump just then. She saw the mark on the inside of his left forearm, and she stopped without meaning to. It was a scar, pale and old and smooth, the color of tallow against his brown skin, and it was shaped like a ring that hadn't finished closing. A circle with a gap in it. A broken ring, near 2 inches across, laid into the soft flesh below his elbow like a maker's stamp. "That's a wicked old scar," Josie said, before she could think better of speaking to him. "How'd you come by it?" Wade glanced down at it the way you'd glance at something that had always been there. "Burn," he said, "from a stove. There was a big iron cook stove at the poorhouse where I was raised. I don't remember it. They told me I fell against it as a baby, before I could walk. Been there long as I've been anything." He pumped water over it, and the scar shone wet. "Doesn't hurt. Looks like a ring," Josie said. "I suppose it does." He rolled his sleeve back down. And that was all. A burn from a poorhouse stove. Sure, That's what they told him, and that's what he believed. Because when you grow up with nothing, you take the story you're given, and you don't turn it over, same as Augustus Thorne never turned over his. Wade Colby had no reason on this earth to think he was anything but a drifter with a flour sack name and an old burn on his arm. But you and I, we're going to notice something. Because 2 days after that, Royce Thorne was washing at that same pump with his own sleeves shoved up, cursing the heat, and there on the inside of Royce's left forearm, same place, same size, same tallow color, was the very same mark. A ring that hadn't closed. A broken ring in the flesh. Royce had had it since birth. Everybody knew about Royce's mark. Augustus had one just like it, and Augustus's father, old Cyrus, had carried one, and Cyrus's father before him. It ran in the Thorne blood, firstborn to firstborn, a birthmark shaped so much like the family's own brand that folks said the Thornes had taken the brand from the mark and not the other way around. The broken ring. It was the reason for the name of the whole outfit. When a Thorne heir was born with that pale ring already printed on his arm, the old people said, the land had claimed him before the priest ever could. Royce carried it and thought nothing of it. He'd carried it all his life. He never once looked across the yard at the silent drifter forking hay and wondered why a poorhouse orphan should bear the Thorne firstborn's mark burned into the very same spot on the very same arm. But it was there. On both of them. And nobody living knew what it meant. Nobody but a broken-down foreman who couldn't sleep, and an old midwife who was about to be brought to the ranch to nurse a dying man's heart. The branding was the last week of May, 3 days before the circuit court was due. This is the part they'll tell in Cottonwood Bend for 50 years. This is the day the yard went silent. The spring branding pulls in every hand on an outfit and half the neighbors besides. And there were 11 of the broken ring men at the fire that morning, and dust, and the ball of calves, and the good rank smell of scorched hide and coffee. Augustus himself had come down from the house, gray-faced, to sit in a chair they'd carried out for him and watch the work he could no longer do. It was payday too. Kel went down the line with the leather sack, calling names, counting silver into each man's palm. When he came to Wade, he counted out a month's wages, $16, 4 weeks at $4, hard money for hard work, and Wade folded his fingers over it and touched his hat. And Royce came off the fence rail. He'd been drinking a little, though it wasn't noon. He'd been watching Wade all morning, watching the hands nod to Wade, watching his own father's eyes rest a beat too long on the new man's face. Something in Royce was raw, and he needed to lance it in front of everybody, the way he always did. "Colby," he said, loud enough to cut the whole yard quiet. "Hold up. Let's have a look at the drifter's fortune." Wade stood still. Royce walked up to him, easy, smiling, and the hands stopped their work one by one because they could feel it coming the way you feel weather. Even Augustus lifted his head. Royce reached out fast and struck Wade's hand from below, and the silver flew up and came down and scattered across the churned mud of the yard. $16. A month of his life. In the dirt at their feet. "There," Royce said. He set his boot on one of the coins and ground it down into the muck. "That's about what a poorhouse name is worth. You come here with nothing and you'll leave with nothing. Because that's what nothing is. Drifter, it doesn't change." His voice rose. He was playing to the fire now, to all of them. "You want to know something? My father built this in 40 years and in 3 days it's mine. All of it. Brand and grass and name. And you know why? Because it's in the blood. You'll never carry the Thorne mark. It's bred, not begged. You could work here till you're gray and die in that tack room, and you'd still be exactly what you are right now. A stray. A thing that wandered in." The yard did not make a sound. The fire popped. A calf bawled once, far off, and quit. Wade Colby looked at Royce Thorne for a long moment. And then he got down on his knees in the mud. "Not to beg. He got down and he began to pick up his money, 1 coin at a time. He wiped each one on his thigh and dropped it in his shirt pocket, unhurried, his face perfectly calm, while 11 men stood frozen, and the Baron watched from his chair with an expression no one could read. Royce's boot was still on the last coin. Wade reached it, and stopped, and looked up, and waited. And after a moment that lasted about a year, Royce, unnerved by the silence he'd made, moved his foot. Wade took the coin. He wiped it. He stood. "Obliged," Wade said quietly. It was the only word he spoke. Then he turned and walked back to the branding fire and picked up his iron. And that is the exact moment the basin fell. By the cookhouse door 30 feet off, an old woman had been standing in the shade watching the whole thing. Nobody had marked her. She'd come out to the ranch 2 days before, brought in a wagon from town to nurse Augustus through his bad nights, a midwife and a nurse, 70 years old, sharp as a tack and near as thin. Prudence Boone. She had a tin basin of water in her hands, meant for the sick room, and she'd been watching Royce grind that silver into the dirt with her mouth pressed flat in disapproval. But it wasn't Royce that made her drop the basin. It was Wade. It was the moment Wade knelt in the mud with his sleeves shoved up from the branding heat, and the sun came full across the inside of his left forearm. And Prudence Boone saw the pale, unfinished ring in his flesh. The basin hit the boards and rang and rolled, and the water went everywhere. Prudence Boone stood with her 2 empty hands still cupped in the air where the basin had been, and her face had gone the color of ash, and she stared at that boy's arm like the dead had come walking up out of the ground to fork hay in the Wyoming sun. She knew that mark. God help her, she knew it. She had seen it once before in all her long life, 19 years back, on a January midnight, on the arm of a newborn boy who cried twice, and then, they told her after, did not survive. She had wrapped that child. She had seen the ring on his arm and thought, there's the Thorne firstborn, plain as print. And then she had been sent out of the birthing room, and by morning the young mother was dead, and there was only one baby in the house, and a foreman with a face like stone had pressed money into her hand and told her to forget she'd ever seen 2. She had spent 19 years forgetting. She had almost managed it. And now here it was, the same mark, walking around a ranch yard at 19 years old. Alive, ma'am? One of the hands had come to help her with the spilled basin. You took a turn? You want to sit? No, Prudence said. Her voice came out cracked. She was still staring across the yard at Wade's back. No, the heat. It's only the heat. She let the man walk her inside, but at the door she stopped and looked back once more at the drifter by the fire, the quiet boy the Baron's son had just ground into the mud, and something old and terrible and long buried turned over in her chest and would not lie back down. She said nothing. That day, she said nothing at all. But she had begun, that very hour, to count backward. 19 years. A January birth, 2 boys and 1 grave. And a mark on a poorhouse orphan's arm that only a Thorne was ever born to carry. The next few days, while the ranch made ready for the circuit court, Prudence Boone went about her nursing and asked her careful questions. She was good at it. 70 years old, and folks talk to old women the way they don't talk to anyone else, because they think old women don't matter and won't remember. She sat with Mrs. Dewar of an evening and let the cook run on, and by, gentle as anything, she brought the talk around. Handsome boy, that new hand. Got a real fine face on him. And Mrs. Dewar, glad to be agreed with, leaned in. Didn't I say the very same? Said it to his face, near about. Got the old Thorne look, I told him, the grandfather's jaw. And didn't Kell come down on me like a roof for saying it? She lowered her voice. Between you and me, Prudy, it fair gave me a start, standing in my own kitchen, looking like a dead man's portrait. But I'm a foolish old woman, and I let it be. When was the boy born, did he say? Winter of '59, near as he knows it. Left at a mining camp poorhouse when he was a mite. Never knew his people. Mrs. Dorr sighed and shook her head over the sorrows of the world. Some poor girl's shame, I expect. It's always the same story. Winter of 1859. Prudence set her cup down very carefully so her hand wouldn't show. Adeline Thorne had died in January of 1859. And her elder son with her. Prudence rode into Cottonwood Bend on the nurse's errand, laudanum for the Baron's knights, she told them, and she went to the little parish and asked the priest, mild as milk, about old baptism records and old graves. She was told the mission church, St. Bride's, kept the older register, out past the far range. She filed it away. She was building something. Stone by stone, the way you build a wall you're afraid to finish. And through all of it, Wade Colby stayed exactly what he had always been. Constant, silent, working. It was Wade who went after the bogged calf. Late in the week, a young steer had wandered into the soft ground down by the creek willows and mired itself to the belly, and it was Royce who found it first, and Royce who tried to rope it out and only sank it deeper, and Royce who finally cursed and coiled his rope and rode off. Not worth a broke leg over one steer, he said to the hand with him. Leave it. It'll pull free, or it won't. And he left it to drown slow in the mud with its eyes rolling. Wade heard of it at supper. He didn't say a word. He got up from the table, got a length of rope and a plank and a lantern, and walked back out into the dark alone. He was gone 3 hours. He came back near midnight, soaked to the chest in creek mud and shaking with cold, and the calf came behind him on a lead, alive, plastered gray, bawling for its mother. He'd gone into the bog himself and dug it free with his hands and levered it out with the plank an inch at a time. He put it in a dry stall and rubbed it down with straw. Then he went and lay in the tack room in his wet clothes, because he had no others, under a thin gray blanket that had been in a horse trough not 3 weeks before. The hands heard about it by morning. Nothing was said out loud, nothing ever was, on that outfit, not with Royce set against the man. But something shifted. The men started leaving Wade the good horse without being asked. Somebody left a dry pair of socks folded on his bunk with no note. Old Kell watched him cross the yard and had to turn away and could not have told you why his eyes stung. Respect, the real kind. The kind Royce Thorne had wanted his whole life and never earned. It was gathering around the silent drifter like cattle gathering to water, slow and sure, and from every direction at once. And Josie Dorr tended his hand. He'd torn it on the creek willows, a long ragged cut across the meat of his palm, and it had gone hot and angry by the second day. And Josie caught him at the pump, trying to wash it one-handed, and made him sit down on the cookhouse step whether he liked it or not. She cleaned it, and put on a poultice her mother swore by, and wrapped it in clean rag, and while she worked, she talked to him. Just talked. About the weather, and the cattle, and a book she was reading, and how she meant to see the ocean one day, even if it took her a lifetime. She talked to him like a man. That's the whole of it, and it mattered more than she knew. Not like a drifter, not like a poorhouse stray, not like a thing that had wandered in. Like a person who was worth telling your dreams to. And Wade, who had gone his whole 19 years without one single soul talking to him as though his listening was worth anything, sat very still and let her voice run over him like the first warm day after a long winter. He didn't say much. But once, just once, when she said something funny about the barn cats, he smiled. A real smile. And Josie looked at that smile and thought, well now, there's a good man in there, and nobody's ever once let him out. This was before anyone knew. Remember that. Before there was one word of a secret, before there was a fortune or a name or a single reason of profit, Josie Dorr was kind to Wade Colby when he was nothing but a hired hand with a hurt hand and a flour sack name. Kindness that costs you nothing to give and buys you nothing to give it. That is the truest kind there is. Hold on to that too. It comes back. That same night, Prudence Boone made up her mind. She'd been turning it and she could not rest. So she did the only thing left to do before she'd let herself believe it. She waited until the boy was alone, mending harness by lantern light in the barn, and she came to him with a cup of coffee like a kindly old woman would, and she sat down on an upturned bucket, and after a little she said, "That's a bad old scar on your arm, son. I couldn't help but notice it, the day of the branding. I've nursed a lot of years. I know most every kind of hurt there is." "Stove burn," Wade said, same as always. "From when I was a baby, at the poorhouse. Doesn't trouble me. May I?" And something in her voice made him hold out his arm without knowing why. She rolled back the sleeve. She took his forearm in her two dry old hands and turned it to the lantern, and she looked at the pale, unfinished ring in his flesh, and Wade felt the old woman's hands begin to tremble, and he saw 2 tears run down the deep creases of her face and drop off her chin onto his wrist. "Ma'am?" he said, alarmed. "You all right?" Prudence Boone looked up at him. She wanted to tell him. Everything in her wanted to tell him right then. But she had no proof yet, only an old woman's certainty, and she knew what a word could do if she loosed it too soon and couldn't back it. So she folded his sleeve back down, gentle as tucking in a child, and she patted his hand. "That's no stove burn, son," she said quietly. "I've dressed 1,000 burns. A stove leaves a burn puckered and shiny and every which way. That mark there was made even, made careful, made whole like it was meant." She stood up slow, holding her back. "You mind and keep it covered from the sun. And you drink your coffee." And she went out of the barn into the dark, and Wade Colby sat there a long time looking at his own arm by the lantern, feeling for the first time in his life like the story he'd been given might have a lie folded up inside it, though he could not for the life of him have said what. Prudence knew now. She was as sure as she'd ever been of anything. That was the mark she had seen on the elder Thorne twin, on the night he was born. The same arm, the same ring. The boy had not died in 1859. The boy was alive, and forking hay for $4 a week, and being ground into the mud by his own younger brother in front of the whole county. And someone had spent 19 years making sure the world believed him dead. She had only to prove it. She meant to ride to St. Bride's Mission the first chance she got and open the old register, and see with her own eyes what names had been written on that midnight. She never got the chance that week. Because the very next day, everything changed at the wash crossing, and this is the part where the whole story turns. There'd been rain up in the mountains. 3 days of it. The kind you don't feel down on the flat, but that comes down the draws later in a brown wall. The wash below the home place, that ran dry as a bone most of the year, was running heavy and fast and rising, and Royce Thorne, being Royce, had to show off. There were men on both sides of the crossing moving cattle, and Royce sat his black mare on the near bank and hollered that he'd take the ford at the run, that a Thorne could cross water that would drown a drifter. He put the spurs to the mare and drove her into the flood. Wade Colby was down the bank 30 yards, and he saw it, and he came up out of his saddle onto his feet already knowing. The mare got halfway and lost her legs. The water took her sideways and rolled her, and Royce went off and under. He came up once, 30 feet down, arms beating, mouth open, and the brown water closed over him again. The men on the banks stood frozen. It was the kind of current you don't go into. Everybody knew it. You don't go in. You'll only make 2 dead men instead of 1. Wade went in. He didn't say a word. He never said a word. He just ran 3 steps down the bank and dove flat into the flood the way you dive off a rock into a summer pond, and the water swallowed him. He came up swimming hard downstream, cutting the current at an angle, and where Royce's dark head broke the surface, Wade was there. And he got a fist in the collar of that good coat, and hauled the man's face up into the air. The wash dragged them both. It slammed them into a snag of drowned cottonwood and near broke Wade's ribs, and he held on. He got an arm around a limb, and he got the other arm locked across Royce's chest, and he held the two of them there in the killing water by main strength while the men ran downstream with ropes. They got a rope to him. Wade tied it round Royce first. Always Royce first, and the men dragged the Baron's son up the bank blue and choking and alive. Then they threw the rope back and pulled Wade out too, and he came up the mud on his hands and knees, coughing brown water, half drowned himself, his eyes gone dim. He didn't rest. He got up. Royce couldn't stand, and Wade lifted him. He lifted the man who'd kicked his blanket in the trough and emptied his wages in the dirt and named him a stray in front of the whole county. He got that man up across his own shoulders and he carried him. A quarter mile, up the track, through the yard, to the door of the big house. And he laid Royce Thorne down on the porch as gentle as you'd lay down a sleeping child, and stepped back, and stood there dripping and swaying, wanting nothing, asking nothing, saying nothing at all. And Augustus Thorne came out onto that porch. The old Baron had heard the shouting, and come down white and shaking on his failing heart, and he knelt by his living son and saw that he breathed, and the relief went through him so hard he had to put a hand on the boards. Then he looked up. He looked up at the drifter standing over them both, soaked and gray and swaying on his feet. The boy who'd gone into a flood no sane man would enter to pull out a son that boy had every reason on earth to let drown. And Augustus Thorne went very still, because the light was on Wade's face. The low gold evening light, sideways off the mountains, and it caught the boy's face full, and Augustus Thorne, who had not been able to bear to remember his dead wife's face for 19 years, who had walled her away with the buried son so he could go on living, Augustus Thorne looked up into the face of the ranch hand and saw Adeline. He saw his dead wife looking back at him out of a stranger's face. The set of the eyes, the line of the brow, the very look she'd had the last morning of her life. He could not breathe. He could not speak. He knelt there on his own porch with one hand on his living son's chest and stared up at the drowned drifter, and something moved in the sealed-off dark of him, something he had spent 2 decades refusing to feel. And it cracked, just a little, just at the edge, and cold air came through the crack. "Boy," Augustus Thorne said. His voice was strange. "Boy, what's your—" But Wade had already turned away. He'd done what wanted doing, and there was no more to do, and he was cold, and the barn was where he belonged. "He'll be all right, sir," Wade said, not looking back. "Just get him warm." And he walked off across the darkening yard toward the tack room and his one thin blanket, leaving the Baron of the Broken Ring kneeling on his porch, staring after him, with his dead wife's face burning in his eyes, and a question rising in him that he did not yet have the courage to ask. Prudence Boone stood in the doorway behind Augustus and watched it all. She watched the old man's face. She watched him see it. And she knew that the wall was cracked now, that the buried thing was working its way up toward the light, and that very soon there would be no putting it back. 21 days had become 3. In 3 days the circuit court would sit, and Judge Merrick would come, and the county recorder would lay the entail on the table for Augustus Thorne to sign the whole broken ring over to Royce, sole and only heir. And out past the far range, in a locked mission chest at St. Bride's, a christening register 19 years old waited in the dark, with 2 names written on one midnight, and one of those names marked deceased in a hand that was not the priest's. Prudence Boone meant to ride for it at first light. She had no idea that someone else had already caught the scent of the thing she was chasing. She had no idea that a man 19 years safe was about to grow very afraid, or what a frightened man with money will do when the past he paid to bury comes clawing back up through the floor of his own life. Prudence Boone rode out before the sun. The far range was cold and gray, and the mare picked her way through the sage, while the old woman held the reins in hands that shook. She was 70 years old. She had carried this thing for 19 years, and it had grown heavy as a stone in a well. Now she meant to set it down. St. Bride's Mission sat where the two creeks met, a low adobe church with a bell that had not rung true since the war. Father Amos was younger than she'd feared. He came out to meet her with flour on his hands, for he'd been at his own bread, and he took one look at her face and stopped smiling. "I need the register," she said. "The christening book." January of 1859. He led her inside. The chest was in the sacristy, locked, and he found the key on a nail behind a hanging vestment. The hinges were stiff. When the lid came up, the smell of old paper and candle tallow rose out of it, and Prudence had to hold the doorframe. Father Amos turned the pages back. 1860. 1859. His finger came down the column of names slow, and then it stopped. "Here," he said, "the Thorne christening. But," he frowned, "there are two." "Read them to me," Prudence said. "Read them out loud. I want to hear it said." Nathaniel Thorne, the priest read, elder born, this 15th of January, 1859, and below him, in the same entry, Royce Thorne, second born, the same night. He looked up. "Twins? I never knew the Baron had twins." "Nobody did," said Prudence. "That was the whole of it. Now look at the first name again. Look what's written beside it." Father Amos bent close. There, cramped into the margin beside Nathaniel's name, in ink a shade darker than the rest, was a single word. "Deceased." "That's not your hand," Prudence said, "nor the priest that was here before you. I watched Father Corwin write that book, and he's dead 12 years. And this was put in after. Look at it. It don't match a letter on the page." The priest looked a long while. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't. The strokes are different. The ink is newer." He set his hand flat on the book. "Who wrote this?" "A frightened man," said Prudence. "Or a paid one. And the boy that word buried is out at the broken ring this minute, forking hay for $4 a week, and being spat on by his own brother, and neither one of them knowing." Her voice broke. "I held him, Father, the elder. I held him not 2 minutes before they took him from my arms and told me he'd died. And I let them. God help me, I let them." Father Amos closed the register gently and held it against his chest. "Then we take this to the law," he said. "Today, the circuit judge sits in 3 days," Prudence said, "at the broken ring, for the signing. If we're not standing in that parlor with this book when the pen comes out, the whole estate passes to the second born, and the truth won't matter after, because there'll be nothing left to give back." She gripped his sleeve. "3 days, Father. We've got 3 days and 100 miles and a man out there who don't want this told." Back at the ranch, Royce Thorne had not stopped burning. Being pulled from the wash had done something ugly to him. A man does not forgive the one who sees him weak. Every hand on the place had heard how the drifter went into the flood and hauled the Baron's son out by the collar, and how he'd carried him home across his shoulders like a sack of feed, and Royce could not walk to the barn without feeling it in the air. So he made Wade pay for it. He put him on the worst horses. He sent him out alone to ride fence in weather that kept the others in. He found the one water barrel gone green and made Wade haul fresh from the creek, bucket by bucket, and stood watching with his thumbs in his belt. "You saved my life, they tell me," Royce said one gray morning, leaning on the corral rail while Wade worked a green colt in the ring. "Ought to thank you, I suppose." He smiled with half his mouth. "But a dog'll pull a drowning man out too if you train it. Don't make the dog a thorn." Wade did not answer. He never answered. He worked the colt down easy, talking to it low, and the colt that had thrown 2 men gentled under his hands like it had known him always. And Royce watched that, and hated it, and did not know why the hating went so deep, only that when he looked at this silent drifter something in him crawled, some old cold thing he had no name for. Mrs. Dorr saw it from the cookhouse window. She had said her piece once and been hushed, and she'd held her tongue since. But she watched Wade gentle that colt, and she watched Royce's face, and she wiped her hands on her apron and said low, to no one, "The Lord's got a joke coming. I can feel it in my knees." Her daughter Josie brought Wade his supper that night out to the barn, because he'd missed the table riding fence. She set the plate on the feed bin and sat on an upturned crate while he ate, and she talked to him about the weather, about a mare that was due, about nothing, the way you talk to a person you count as a person. Wade listened. Now and again he said a few words back. It was the only easy hour he had in a week, and neither of them knew yet that it was worth anything more than what it was. "You never say where you're from," Josie said. "Poorhouse," said Wade. "Mining camp, up north. Don't remember any before it. No people? None that wanted keeping." He said it without pity, the way a man reads off a brand. "I stopped minding it a long time back." Josie looked at him a moment. "Maybe you had people," she said. "Maybe they just didn't get the chance to want you." And she didn't know how true it was, and neither did he, and the lantern threw both their shadows long against the tack room wall. Prudence Boone came back to the broken ring the second evening, worn to the bone, the register wrapped in oilcloth under her coat. She meant to go careful. She meant to speak first to Augustus, alone, and lay it out gentle, for the old man's heart was bad, and this was a thing that could stop it. But before she could reach him, she had to be sure of the last piece. She had to know how the boy was taken, and by whose hand, and there was only one man living who could tell her: Josiah Kell. The old foreman was 58 and looked 100. He'd not slept right since the drifter rode in. The boy had his mother's jaw, Adeline's very jaw, and Kell had spent 19 years telling himself the thing he'd done was buried past finding. He was in the harness room, mending a cinch, when Prudence found him, and she shut the door behind her, and she did not sit down. "I opened the book, Josiah," she said. Kell's hands went still on the leather. "2 sons," she said. "And a lie in the margin in a hand that isn't the priest's. I know it's not yours, you never could write. So somebody wrote it for you, or you paid it wrote. I attended that birth. I held the elder alive and squalling and marked with the ring on his arm, and you came and took him, and an hour later you told the whole house he'd died with his mother. I want to know where you carried a living child, and I want to know who paid you to carry him." For a long while the old man said nothing. The cinch hung forgotten in his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice came out cracked and low, like something dragged up from a dry well. "You'll hang me," he said. "I'll do worse than that," said Prudence. "I'll leave you to die with it still in your mouth. Talk, Josiah. You're sick. I can see it on you. Don't carry this into the ground. Where's the boy come from?" Kell's face crumpled. 40 years of hard bark, and it all went at once. "Ashford," he whispered. "Harlan Ashford." It was Ashford. Prudence stood very still. "He come to me the week before the birth," Kell said. "Said the Thorne line was too strong, 2 heirs and a spread this size, and the broken ring would own the whole basin inside a generation, and there'd be nothing left for the Ashford brand nor anybody else. Said if there was just the one heir, a single thread, well, threads break. He gave me $500 in gold. More money than I'd see in 10 years of foreman's wages." Kell's shoulders shook. "I told myself I'd not kill it. I couldn't do that. So when the twins come, and Adeline died, and everything was crying, and blood, and dark, I took the first one. The elder. I told the Baron it come dead. And I rode 2 days north, and I left it at a mining camp poorhouse with $1 pinned to the blanket. And I said its name was... I don't even know what I said. Colby, I made it up. Wade Colby, if they asked. And I rode home, and I never once looked to see had it lived or died." He put his face in his hands. "It lived. God forgive me, Prudence. It lived, and it's out there in my own barn, and I've watched Royce spit on it for 2 months, and I've said nothing." Prudence Boone shut her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears in the seams of her face, but her voice was iron. "Then you'll say something now," she said. "You'll stand before the judge in 3 days and you'll say every word of it. You'll give that boy back his name. Ashford'll kill me." "Ashford," said Prudence, "is about to have a great deal else to worry over." But Harlan Ashford had ears in that country. 55 years old, gray and heavy and slow-smiling, he'd built his spread on knowing things before other men knew them, and word reached him that the old midwife had ridden to St. Bride's and come back with something under her coat. That was enough. A man does not stay rich in cattle country by waiting to see how a threat turns out. He rode to the Broken Ring the very next day, and he sat in Augustus Thorne's study with his hat on his knee and his voice full of neighborly grief. "Augustus," he said, "your heart's bad. Everybody knows it. And here's this drifter you took on. And now there's talk, wild talk, the kind that follows a big estate like flies follow a herd. Folk saying he favors your late wife. Folk stirring. You know how it goes. Somebody's fixing to make trouble over the succession, and if that court sits with the thing unsigned, they'll tie the Broken Ring up in claims for 10 years, and Royce'll inherit a lawsuit instead of a ranch." He leaned forward. "Sign it now, old friend. Don't wait on the judge. Get the recorder out here tomorrow at dawn. Quiet. And put the entail in Royce's hand while it's still clean. Once it's signed and filed, no drifter's tail can touch it." Augustus Thorne sat gray and tired behind his desk. His heart had been a fist of pain for a week. And he was afraid, not of what Ashford said, but of what he himself had seen on his own porch. The drifter's face turning in the lamplight. Adeline's face, and the question that had risen in him then and never gone back down. He was afraid of that question. And a frightened man will take the easy road if you point it out to him. "Tomorrow, then," he said. "Lo, dawn, get it done." And that same night, Harlan Ashford's men took Josiah Kell. They came to the harness room after dark and told the old foreman there was a sick horse up at the Ashford place needed his eye, and Kell, who knew what they were and dared not refuse, went with them and did not come back. His only living witness spirited off the ranch 30 miles gone by moonrise. And when Prudence Boone came to the gate the next morning with the oilcloth bundle under her coat and Father Amos beside her on a borrowed horse, 2 of Ashford's riders were sitting the road, and they turned her back. "No visitors this morning, ma'am," said the nearer one, and his hand rested easy on his saddle gun. "Family business. You'll want to move along." For one long, terrible moment it looked to be over. The recorder was already inside. The pen was already on the table. Kell was gone. The gate was closed. And the truth of 19 years stood shut out in the cold road with an old woman and a young priest and a book that no one would let them open. But Prudence Boone had not carried this stone for 19 years to drop it at a gate. "Father," she said quietly, "there's a wash comes up behind the horse pasture. We used to drive the milk cows through it." Ride, inside the Broken Ring parlor, the dawn light came gray and then gold through the lace at the windows. The county recorder had spread his papers on the long table. Judge Merrick, who had come a day early and lodged the night rather than ride in the dark, stood by the cold hearth with his coffee, watching. For something in this hurried dawn signing sat wrong with him, and he was a man who trusted his own unease. Augustus Thorne sat at the head of the table, gray as ash. Royce stood behind his father's chair in a clean coat, and he could not keep the pleasure off his face. Harlan Ashford stood by the window with his thumbs in his vest. Along the walls stood the hands, called in as witnesses to the signing, the same 11 men who had stood at the branding fire and watched Royce empty Wade's wages in the mud. Mrs. Doer stood in the kitchen doorway with her apron twisted in both fists. Josie beside her. And Wade Colby stood at the very back, near the door, because he'd been called in with the rest and did not understand why, and wanted only to get back to the barn. The recorder cleared his throat. The entail of the Broken Ring estate, he read, 12,000 acres, together with all stock, buildings, and water rights, to pass entire to the acknowledged heir of the body of Augustus Thorne, namely, Royce Thorne, sole surviving son. He set the pen by Augustus's hand. "Your mark, sir," and it's done. Augustus Thorne picked up the pen. His hand shook, and the door at the back of the parlor slammed open, and cold morning air came in with it, and Prudence Boone stood in the frame with mud to her knees and Father Amos at her shoulder, and a book held up in both her hands. "Don't sign it," she said. "That entail is a lie, and I can prove it in the sight of God and this judge. And if you put your name to it, Augustus Thorne, you'll damn your own soul and rob your own firstborn son in the same stroke." The room went dead still. Ashford came off the window. "Judge, this woman's been turned away once already. She's got my ear," said Judge Merrick, and set down his coffee. "I came to see a signing done lawful. A woman crossing a room to swear a thing's unlawful is exactly what I'm here to hear. Stand where you are, Ashford." He turned. "Come forward, ma'am. What have you got?" Prudence walked the length of the parlor and laid the register open on the signing table, right across the entail paper, and Father Amos stepped up beside her. "This is the christening register of St. Bride's Mission," the priest said. "Kept in a locked chest these 19 years. I opened it myself 2 days past, before this woman and before God. Judge, I'd have you read the entry for January the 15th, 1859. Read it out, so the room hears it in your voice, and not mine." Judge Merrick bent over the book. He read for a moment in silence. Then he read aloud. "Baptized this 15th of January, 1859, at St. Bride's Mission, the sons of Augustus and Adeline Thorne." He stopped. He looked up sharp. "Sons, plural, read the names," said Prudence. "Nathaniel Thorne," the judge read, "elderborn." His voice changed. "And Royce Thorne, secondborn, the same night." "Twins," he looked at Augustus. "You had twins, sir. Augustus Thorne had gone white as the lace at the window." "The elder died," he whispered. "He died with his mother. They told me. Kell told me. He came dead into the world. I buried an empty. He could not finish." "Look at the margin, Judge," said Father Amos softly. "Beside the elder's name." Merrick looked. "There's a word written here. Deceased." He held the book to the window light, tilted it, brought it close to his eye. "In a different ink. A different hand entirely from the body of the entry." He set it down slowly. "This word was added after the fact. This is not the priest's writing." "No, sir, it is not," said Prudence Boone. "I stood in that room the night those boys were born. I am the midwife that caught them both. I held the elder alive in my 2 hands, and I marked with my own eyes the sign every Thorne firstborn is born with, the pale ring on the inner left arm, the broken ring, the very mark this ranch took its brand from. And I watched Josiah Kell carry that living child out of the house, and an hour later I heard him tell you it was born dead. And I was threatened to my silence, and I have carried it 19 years, and I'll carry it no more." She turned. She raised her arm and she pointed down the length of the room, to the door, to the silent man standing at the back who had not moved and did not understand. "That elder son is standing in this room," she said. "You've all watched him break his back for $4 a week. You've watched that man," she swung her finger to Royce, "empty his wages in the mud and tell him the Thorne mark is bred, not begged. Well, let's see what's bred and what isn't. Wade Colby, come here to me, son, and roll up your left sleeve." Every face in the parlor turned, Wade stood frozen at the back, and for the first time in 2 months there was something on his face that was not patience. It was fear, plain fear, the fear of a man who has spent his life being nobody and feels the whole weight of a room turn on him at once. "I didn't do anything," he said. I don't know what she's." "You didn't do a thing wrong in your life, boy," said Prudence gently. "That's the whole grief of it. Come here." He came. Slow, through the parted hands, the mud on Prudence's skirts and the gold light on the lace, and the old Baron risen half out of his chair, and Wade came and stood before the table, and Prudence took his left arm, and she pushed the sleeve up over his forearm. There it was. The pale scar, shaped like a ring that didn't quite close. The mark he'd been told all his life was a burn from a poorhouse stove. "Now," said Prudence, and she turned to Royce Thorne, and her voice was very quiet. "You, sir, the true-born, the bred, not the begged. Show the room your left arm. You've flashed it enough times bragging on it. Show it now." Royce did not move. All the color had gone out of his face. "He won't," said Prudence, "so I'll tell you what's on it. The same mark. The Thorne firstborn's ring, the both of them, because they were born the same night of the same mother, and it's the one thing that lie in the margin couldn't touch. Judge, turn their arms to the light, side by side, and tell this room what you see." Judge Merrick took each young man by the wrist and turned their forearms up to the window, and the morning light fell on 2 arms, and on 2 pale rings that did not close, the very same in size and shape and place, as like as 2 brands off the same iron. The breath went out of the whole room at once. You could hear it. 11 hands, and a cook, and a judge, and a dying baron, and every one of them let go the same breath in the same instant, and the silence after it was the loudest thing in that house. Augustus Thorne rose fully to his feet. He came around the table slow, an old man with a failing heart, and he crossed the parlor to the drifter he'd hired for $4 a week, and he stood before him and looked up into his face. Adeline's face. The face he'd been afraid of on the porch in the lamplight, and his eyes ran over freely and without shame. "You came back to me twice then," Augustus said, and his voice was broke all the way through. "Once from the river, and once from the dead." He lifted a shaking hand and laid 2 fingers on the pale ring inside the boy's arm, the very mark he had last seen on a newborn's skin the night his wife died. "I held this arm," he whispered. "I held it before they took you. 19 years I mourned an empty box. And you were forking my hay, my son. My firstborn son." Wade Colby stood shaking. 19 years of being no one, of splitting his bread with barn cats, because there was nothing else in the world that would take his kindness, and he had no place to put a thing this size. His mouth worked. Nothing came out, and the old man put both arms around him, frail as he was, and held him, and after a long moment Wade's arms came up slow and held him back. And the man who could not imagine he had ever been wanted by anyone stood in the middle of the broken ring parlor and was wanted, at last, in front of them all. Judge Merrick let it be for a moment. Then he spoke, because the law was still standing on the table. On the sworn word of the attending midwife, the evidence of the parish register, and the plain matching mark on both these men, he said, "I find that Augustus Thorne is father to twin sons, Nathaniel the elder and Royce the younger, and that Nathaniel, called Wade Colby, is living and stands before me. The entail as written names the wrong heir. An estate cannot pass over a living firstborn to the secondborn by way of a forged death. This document does not sign." He picked up the entail and set it aside, face down. The recorder, pale, capped his pen. And now the fall came, and it came one man at a time, in front of the same witnesses who had watched the branding fire. Royce Thorne stood where he'd stood behind his father's chair, and the whole ground of his life had gone out from under him in the space of 5 minutes. An hour ago he'd been sole heir to 12,000 acres. Now the judge had named him second born and named the drifter first. "A man's blood shows in his boots," Royce said, his own words, the fine, sneering words he'd thrown at Wade 100 times, and they came out of him now small and cracked, because the blood had spoken and it had not said what he'd been so sure it would say. His face emptied. He looked at his own left arm as if it belonged to a stranger. "The mark's bred, not begged," he said, to no one. And then he had no more words at all. He sat down hard in his father's chair and put his face down and did not lift it, and no one in that room, not one of the 11 men he'd lorded over, moved to comfort him. Then the hands came in from the yard, and between two of them, stumbling, came old Josiah Kell. Ashford's men had run for it when the judge's business turned, and the broken ring riders had caught the old foreman at the fork of the road and brought him back. He stood swaying in the parlor, sick and gray, and he looked at Wade one time, and then he broke entire. "I did it," Kell said. "Judge, I did it. I'll say it all. I took the elder twin the night he was born, and I carried him off, and I said he died. And I did it for money. $500 in gold." He lifted his shaking hand, and he pointed it straight at the heavy gray man by the window. "Harlan Ashford paid me. He wanted the Thorne line cut down to one thread so his brand could swallow the range when the old man passed. He paid me the gold, and he told me a single heir was easier to outlast than two. I've carried it 19 years and it's killing me, and I don't care what you do to me now. It's the truth. That man bought a baby's life to buy himself a valley." Harlan Ashford went for the door. He got 2 steps. Judge Merrick's voice stopped him like a rope. "Hold him." The hands closed around Ashford. He blustered. It was an old man's word against his. It couldn't be proved. He'd sue the county. But the register was on the table in a forged hand, and the midwife had sworn, and now the foreman had named him plain, and the judge had heard enough hurried dawn signings to know the smell of one. "Harlan Ashford," Merrick said, "you'll answer before this court for the bribing of a witness, the falsifying of a parish record, the theft and abandonment of a child, and the unlawful removal of Josiah Kell from this ranch not 12 hours past to keep him from speaking. Take him." And they took him, the big gray man who'd meant to own the basin, out through the same door the drifter had come in by, and the range he'd schemed 19 years to swallow was lost to him by the same paper he'd paid to see burned. When it was done, when the room could breathe again, Augustus Thorne turned to his elder son and asked, did not tell, what he would have done, what justice he wanted. For it was his now, or would be, all of it, and the man who'd humiliated him sat broken not 6 feet away. And Wade Colby, Nathaniel Thorne, looked at Royce a long moment. At his brother. The brother who had kicked his blanket in the trough and emptied his wages in the mud and called him a dog. And whatever the whole room expected of him, it was not what he said. "Let him keep his place," Wade said quietly. "Let him stay on at the ranch. I know what it is to have nothing, sir. I know it better than any man in this room." He looked at Royce, and there was no triumph in it. None at all. "I won't hand that to him. Not even to him. He humiliated no one. The room that had watched him be humiliated watched him decline to return it, and that, more than the mark, or the register, or the judge's ruling, was the thing that told every man there whose son he truly was. Autumn came to the broken ring 6 months on. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone to gold, and the chimney of the ranch house ran a steady thread of smoke into a hard blue sky, and the whole yard smelled of Mrs. Doer's bread, for she baked on Thursdays, and this was a Thursday. The brand on the stock was the same broken ring it had always been. Only now it belonged, by law and by right, and by the plain mark on his own arm, to the tall, quiet man mending the west fence in the cold sunlight. Nathaniel worked the same fences he'd worked as a hired hand. He said it kept him honest. Josie Doer stood at the rail beside him with her sleeves pushed up, handing him staples one at a time, and now and again she said something that made the quiet man laugh, which was a thing the ranch had never once heard in his first hard months, and now heard most every day. Augustus Thorne sat on the porch with a blanket over his knees. His heart was no better. The doctor from town had stopped promising him springs. But he sat in the gold light and watched his two sons down at the far gate, mending a hinge together, not talking much, passing the tools back and forth, and there was a peace on the old man's face that no amount of doctoring could have put there. Nathaniel had asked that Royce stay, and Royce had stayed, and the two of them had not become friends. Not exactly. Not yet. But Royce had learned to hand his brother a tool without a sneer. And once, that summer, thrown from a green horse into the creek, Royce had come up sputtering to find his brother's hand already reaching down for him, and he had taken it, and neither of them had said a word about the wash and the flood and the first time. It was a start. It was more than most families are given. Prudence Boone lived out her days in the little room off the kitchen, absolved at last. 70 years old and sleeping through the night for the first time since a January midnight 19 winters gone. She kept the christening register on the mantel where the light could reach it, and sometimes she'd take it down and run her thumb over the two names, and set it back, and go on about her day. Harlan Ashford never worked his range again. The court took him, and the county sold his spread to pay back what he owed the Thornes, and the valley he'd wanted whole went in pieces to a dozen honest men. And Royce, the arrogant heir who'd said blood shows in a man's boots, Royce learned, slow and hard over that long autumn, to say his brother's name. Nathaniel, out loud. Which for a man like that was the longest journey of all. You want to know what it teaches? A story like this. It's a plain thing, and an old one, and it's this. Blood is proven in the doing, not the boasting. A man showed up cold and silent and split his bread with the barn cats when he had nothing, and carried home the brother who spat on him, and asked no man to bow, and that was the Thorne firstborn all along, marked in the flesh, waiting on the world to look a little closer. If you've ever been the one nobody looked twice at, tell me where you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story rode. And if it moved you, stay a while. There's another one coming.